It's hard to think of a more eccentric, yet universally respected group worldwide than the Yamato, better known as the Japanese, one of the oldest, most isolated, large civilizations. Well, up until the past century, that is, when Japan transformed from a feudal, isolationist group of islands into one of the most feared, formidable, and disciplined navy and land based powers the world had ever seen, defeating the Chinese, Russians, British, Dutch, French, and Americans in the Far East, for a time, of course. Yes, the modern nation of Japan may have a quite colorful culture and a less than utopian past with some of their neighbors, but perhaps no other nation, other than America, has permeated the global market in terms of culture, media, movies, and recognition. Japan epitomizes the balance between old, traditional, honor based, family centric Oriental cultures and the so called modern Western world, which has impacted the country in interesting ways to say the least. Today, we'll be discussing the origins and evolution of the modern people of Japan and see which nations have the highest genetic and linguistic similarities that can paint a picture as to the migrations and assimilation that gave rise to this highly unique group of people and contributed to many aspects of their culture and customs. Japan is one of the largest island chains in Asia and the world after the Malay archipelago, and is traditionally divided into four main major landmasses and what are known as the home islands, that being Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku, and there are a few other smaller islands and regions of settlement we'll get to later. Honshu is by far the largest and most densely populated, containing 104 million people of Japan's 126 million population. However, in the distant past, during the last glacial maximum, or when the sea level was at its lowest, it's believed that these islands were actually one landmass and connected to the mainland of Asia in the north, south, and west, which is where the first migrants to the islands originated from, traveling by land and settling over a period of thousands of years, and the first people to have inhabited any part of the modern country of Japan arrived around 35,000 BC from the south. The earliest known settlers were possibly of Australoid origin, or at least contained Australoid admixture, judging by the presence of haplogroup D, a very ancient haplogroup shared by only two other modern populations in the world, that being Tibetans and, strangely enough, the Andamanese, a highly isolated community who have remained genetically untouched for thousands of years. So although they shared the same lineage, they became two extremely divergent populations in the present day. The latter people, that developed around 16,000 years later, are referred to as the Jomon, likely originating from Siberia, and are recognized to be ethnically, linguistically, and physically distinct from the incoming population known as the Yayoi, originating from the Korean peninsula, who brought the Nihongo or Japonic languages, which would become dominant in the vast majority of the islands. Haplogroup D is virtually absent from all East Asian populations, sans the Japanese and Tibetans, which shows a strong migrational pull and assimilation towards these regions, but not much backwards movement outside to other regions, and is strongest in the northern region of Japan and the Ryukyuan Islands, showing they have the highest degree of genetic similarity to the ancient Jomon population, who were a divergent Eastern Asian population, possibly mixed with the indigenous tribes that had come before them. The combination of the Jomon and Yayoi is what created the modern Yamato, or ethnic Japanese people. So Japan today may have an extreme ethnic and cultural homogeneity and conformity, but not a genetic one. And interestingly, the closest to an example of the pure Jomon phenotype in Japan today would be the Ainu, located in the far north and small pockets on Hokkaido. The Ainu have long confounded anthropologists for their obvious genetic and morphological differences from the Yamato, and it had long been proposed that they were the descendants of Caucasians or a Western Eurasian people, although it has been proven now that the phenotypic similarities to modern Western Eurasians is almost certain to be an example of convergent evolution, as having evolved in two similar regions, Eastern Siberia and Northern Europe, they have various commonalities with Europeans not seen in other East Asians, such as lighter skin, taller stature, heavier build, hairier faces and bodies, and even a higher alcohol tolerance. The Ainu and the Joman people, therefore, are Eastern Eurasians who had diverged significantly from a genetic standpoint, becoming their own cluster and phenotype, similar to how the Niger-Congo speakers of Africa diverged from the Khoi, Pygmies, and Nilotes, while still belonging to the same sub-Saharan African base. It's also been proposed that the Ainu, and by extension the whole of the Joman people, have a similar origin as the Native Americans, or at least a common ancestor, proposed mostly due to cultural and physical similarities between the two. The Ainu still do exist today, although their numbers are rather minuscule at less than 50,000 and shrinking by the day due to low birth rates and assimilation, having previously inhabited all of Hokkaido, northern Honshu, and southern Sakhalin, although now are confined to small segments of Hokkaido and neighboring regions, although many times more Japanese and to a lesser extent Russians have some recent Ainu ancestry. The Yamato people do have Joman ancestry, however, just not nearly as much as the Ainu, around 5 to 20% depending on the individual, and hence can display a wider range of phenotypes than some other East Asians, as there are indeed ethnic, linguistic, and cultural differences even between the Yamato and the home islands, which we'll get to later. There are many theories as to the origin of the Japanese language, and many people falsely assume that Japanese and Chinese are somehow related or similar, or that maybe they could understand each other to a certain extent, and no, other than the fact that Japanese and Chinese share many of the same characters in their written form, and hence would be legible to one another, the languages have little to nothing in common, and it's been recognized for centuries by Western and Eastern scholars that the two languages don't share a common origin, despite their proximity and limited shared influence. Some of the more interesting theories propose an early divergence from the Austronesian language originating in Taiwan, as Austronesian groups did inhabit some parts of southern China, or even a connection to the Dravidian languages of South Asia from ancient Indian migrants and shared vocabulary not seen in Chinese, although the most famous theory would be the Altaic connection, which posits a common origin for the Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, Korean, and Japonic languages. Although widely discredited as a whole, there may be a bit of truth in the Altaic connection, as although seen as language isolates, Korean is likely the most similar language to Japanese, excluding the Ryukyuan languages of the Ryukyu Islands, which are part of the Japonic language family, yet are not mutually intelligible with the dialects spoken on the mainland, and most Ryukyuans consider themselves to be ethnically distinct from the Yamato, despite being incorporated into Japan in the 1800s. The Japanese considered the Koreans, and Taiwanese to a certain extent, to be the most similar to themselves out of all the people groups in their immediate vicinity. And before and during World War II, the state attempted to ethnically assimilate these groups into the greater Japanese nation, by way of discouraging and outright banning their native languages and culture, in order to aid in the colonization of other regions of Asia under their control. Koreans are more closely related genetically to some other Northeast Asian groups such as the Manchurians, but seeing that the Yayoi originated from Korea, the Japanese share much of the same ancestry, albeit with a Joman component not seen in Korea or anywhere else in mainland Asia, except for trace amounts from later Japanese migration. In Japan, there are essentially four main genetic and cultural regions, that being the Northeast, Southwest, Hokkaido, and the Ryukyu Islands. There are also the Izu Islands branching out southeast into the Pacific, whose language and culture is actually the most divergent branch of Japanese, being isolated out in the middle of the ocean, although in the present day less than 30,000 people still inhabit this scant island chain, with the number dropping by the day. Amazingly, even further to the southeast of the Izu Islands are the Bonin Islands, or the Ogasawara Archipelago, which was actually only recently inhabited despite being known to the Japanese for generations, and most on the island speak an English-based language known as Bonin Creole, a relic of an American military presence on the island after World War II, with a large but unknown percentage of the 2,000 inhabitants having European ancestry from American soldiers or other personnel. Now, interestingly, the Japanese also formerly inhabited the Kuril Islands in the southern half of the island of Sakhalin in the Sea of Okhotsk, a territory previously known as Karafuto Prefecture, an area which the Yamato had been settling for centuries, leading to conflict when the Russians also laid claim to the island in the late 1800s. The Japanese relinquished control of the island, although during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, regained control and re-established settlements in the southern half, and achieved a population of nearly 500,000 by the peak period of Japanese imperialism. The Japanese, who had taken over nearly the entirety of East and Southeast Asia before and during World War II, had sent large numbers of colonists to many regions that, in the grand scheme, were meant to become an extension of the Japanese homeland, especially Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, and Micronesia. Although nearly all of these colonists, even those who had nothing to do with the Japanese military, were repatriated back to Japan following the end of World War II, there was also quite a large population of mixed Japanese Micronesian citizens left behind who had been fathered by Japanese military personnel, or were the result of interracial marriage, which did occur in large numbers. There have been numerous prominent politicians and several presidents of partial Japanese origin in the region of Micronesia, and it's estimated that today 10 to 20% of the Micronesian population has some degree of Japanese ancestry from the Japanese colonists. Other regions with a significant Japanese population include the state of Hawaii, of course, which we discussed in a recent video, as well as the mainland United States, Canada, South America, with a large and extremely affluent community in Peru and Brazil, and Australia. More recent, somewhat transient communities include a moderate but growing Japanese expatriate population in Southeast Asia, mostly the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia, who are mostly retirees, but it's also not uncommon for Japanese men to marry native Southeast Asian women and settle down or return to Japan. So as mentioned in the beginning, though most people tend to think of Japan as a homogeneous, traditional society, they're actually the result of a fusion of multiple different cultures, phenotypes, languages, and gene pools, creating the unique population we see today. And Japan has influenced many different societies around the world in the past and present day, and in turn, the Japanese identity is a complex situation that is still evolving just like every other nation on the planet. So please let me know your thoughts on the ethnic origins of the Yamato, Ryukyuans, and Ainu, and for today's poll, tell me which Japanese group you would like to know more about. And as always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.